Ben was a simple man with a big dream. He lived in a busy city where noise and crowds were a part of everyday life. Every day, after work, he would sit by his small apartment window and imagine a quiet place where he could relax. A place with fresh air, tall trees, and a calm lake. A place he could call his own. For many years, Ben worked hard. He saved money slowly, cutting small expenses here and there. He didn't buy fancy clothes or eat out often. Instead, he kept his eyes on one goal, buying a small cabin by a lake. He wanted to wake up to the sound of birds and feel the sun on his face without the city noise. One chilly spring morning, Ben found a small cabin for sale near a peaceful lake. The cabin was old but charming, with wooden walls that smelled like pine and a porch that looked out over the water. It was surrounded by tall trees, and the lake sparkled under the morning sun. It was perfect. The cabin was in a small community, a neighborhood where several families had homes around the lake. This neighborhood was run by a homeowners association, or HOA. The HOA made rules for everyone to keep the area clean, safe, and beautiful. Ben read the HOA rules carefully and felt confident he could follow them. The peaceful life he dreamed of was within reach. When Ben bought the cabin, he felt a wave of happiness he had never felt before. He spent the first few days cleaning the cabin, fixing the old wooden porch, and painting the door a bright blue. He could already imagine himself fishing from the dock or sitting outside with a cup of coffee watching the sun rise. The neighbors were polite but kept to themselves. Most of the families were quiet and enjoyed the calm of the lake. Ben liked the peace but also hoped to make friends with some of the neighbors over time. For now, he enjoyed the calm mornings and the sound of the lake lapping against the shore. One afternoon, as Ben was cleaning the yard, a woman approached his cabin. She was tall, with sharp eyes and a serious expression. Her name was Karen, and she was the president of the HOA. She wore a neat blouse and a skirt that showed she took her role seriously. "Hello, Ben," she said, smiling but with a tone that seemed more business than friendly. "I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood. It's important that everyone follows the rules here." Ben nodded politely. "Thank you, Karen. I'm looking forward to being part of the community." Karen looked around the yard, her eyes sharp. "I noticed some plants near the fence. You'll want to make sure everything stays within your property line. The HOA is very strict about boundaries." Ben smiled, feeling a little nervous. "Of course. I'll be careful." Karen left, but Ben couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching him more closely than other neighbors. At first, he thought it was just because he was new, but soon he noticed Karen visiting more often, always with a sharp look and questions about his plans. Days passed, and Ben settled into his new life. He fished early in the morning, sat by the fire pit in the evening, and began to feel a sense of peace he had never known before. But Karen's visits continued. Sometimes she stopped by to talk about rules, sometimes to remind him about keeping the yard clean or not parking in certain spots. Ben tried to be friendly and cooperative, but Karen's tone was always firm, almost like she was testing him. One afternoon, Ben found a note on his door from the HOA. It said there was a problem with his property, and he needed to attend a meeting. Ben was confused and worried. He went to the meeting and found Karen there, with other members of the HOA board. Karen spoke first. "Ben, there is a question about the ownership of your cabin," she said clearly. "The HOA has received a claim from my son, Mark, who says this cabin belongs to him through old papers that were never properly recorded." Ben's heart sank. "But I bought the cabin legally. I have the papers from the sale." Karen shook her head. The HOA has rules about ownership and disputes. We need to investigate further. Ben felt like the ground was shaking beneath him. How could this be happening? He had done everything right. He felt confused and angry but stayed calm. The HOA meeting ended without answers, but Ben knew things were about to get much harder. As Ben left the meeting, he saw Mark, Karen's son, standing nearby. Mark was younger, with a confident smile. He looked at Ben as if the cabin already belonged to him. Ben felt powerless. The place he had dreamed of was suddenly surrounded by doubt and fear. His peaceful lake cabin, the place he wanted to call home, was now at the center of a fight he never wanted. That night, Ben sat by the window of his cabin, staring out at the calm lake. The moon reflected on the water like a silver path. He took a deep breath and promised himself he would fight for what was rightfully his. The dream cabin was his, and he was not going to give up without a fight. Ben woke up early the next morning. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky with soft colors. He looked out the window at the lake. The water was still calm, but inside Ben, there was a storm of worry. The letter from the HOA, the strange claim by Karen's son Mark, and the tense meeting all weighed heavily on his mind. He had bought the cabin with his own money. The papers were clear. How could someone else claim it? And why did the HOA believe Karen's family without checking everything carefully? Ben decided he needed to learn more. He wanted to understand the rules of the HOA and how this strange claim could happen. He also wanted to protect his cabin and his dream. Over the next few days, Ben began asking questions. He visited the HOA office and talked to the staff. They told him that sometimes old documents were confusing, and the HOA had to follow certain procedures to keep peace in the community. Ben also spoke to some neighbors. Many of them were kind and friendly, but when he asked about Karen and her family, their faces changed. A few shook their heads quietly. One neighbor whispered, "Karen's family has been powerful here for a long time. They do things their way." Ben felt a chill. He did not want trouble with his neighbors, but he also knew he had to stand up for himself. Then, the warning signs started to appear. One afternoon, Ben was working in his yard when he noticed a small group of people from the HOA walking nearby. They looked closely at his property, measuring the fence and taking notes. Karen arrived shortly after, as if on cue. She smiled at Ben, but her eyes were sharp. "We have to make sure everything is perfect here," she said. "The HOA has rules about the look of properties, and we expect all owners to follow them." Ben nodded, trying to hide his frustration. "I'm happy to keep the cabin looking nice," he said calmly. Karen smiled again but then lowered her voice. "Ben, you should be careful. Sometimes, small mistakes can cause big problems." Ben didn't like the way she said that. It felt like a warning, but he wasn't sure what it meant. Days later, Ben found another note on his door. This time, it was more serious. The HOA was asking him to remove some plants he had planted near the fence. The plants were small, but the HOA said they blocked the view and were against the community rules. Ben felt confused. The plants were healthy and made the cabin look nice. But he didn't want to cause trouble, so he carefully removed the plants. Still, the visits from Karen didn't stop. She came by often, sometimes with Mark. Mark was always polite, but Ben noticed the way Mark looked around the cabin, as if claiming ownership without saying a word. One evening, Ben attended another HOA meeting. He hoped to speak and explain his side. But Karen and the board seemed ready to ignore him. Karen spoke first. We must protect the community's interests, she said firmly. This is not about one person, but about fairness for all. Ben stood up, his voice steady but strong. I bought this cabin legally. I have all the papers. I just want to live peacefully here. The room grew quiet. Some neighbors looked at Ben with sympathy. Others seemed unsure. Karen shook her head. We will investigate further. Until then, the status of the cabin is unclear. Ben left the meeting feeling more alone than ever. The people who were supposed to protect the community seemed to be protecting Karen's family instead. That night, Ben sat by the lake again. The moonlight danced on the water, but his heart was heavy. He thought about giving up, about walking away from the cabin. But then he remembered all the hard work it took to get here. He thought about the peaceful mornings, the quiet nights, the dream he had held for so long. He knew he could not give up. Over the next week, Ben kept a close eye on his cabin. He fixed small things, like broken steps and loose nails, hoping to avoid any real complaints. But he also began to watch Karen and Mark more carefully. He saw how Karen used her power, speaking to neighbors in a way that made them afraid to speak out. He saw Mark moving furniture into the cabin, acting like the owner. Ben realized this was not just about a piece of property. It was about control. One afternoon, Ben met an older neighbor named Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis had lived in the community for over 20 years. He told Ben quietly, Karen has always wanted to keep her family in charge. Sometimes she forgets what's fair. Ben nodded. I just want to live here peacefully. Mr. Lewis smiled sadly. Sometimes, to live peacefully, you have to stand up. Ben thanked Mr. Lewis. Those words stayed with him. Slowly, Ben began to understand the real challenge. This was not just about a cabin. It was about fairness, respect, and standing up when things felt wrong. He decided he would fight for his cabin. Not with anger or loud words, but with courage and patience. He would find a way to show everyone the truth. As the days passed, Ben prepared himself. He studied the HOA rules, gathered his papers, and talked quietly to neighbors who felt the same way. The peaceful lake that had once been just a dream was now a place where a quiet battle was beginning. And Ben was ready to fight for his home. Ben's days grew busier, but not with the peace he had hoped for. Instead, his time was filled with meetings, phone calls, and visits to the HOA office. The claim by Karen's son, Mark, hung over him like a dark cloud. No matter how much Ben tried to prove his ownership, the HOA seemed to close their doors to him. Ben was careful. He kept all his papers organized and copied every document he had. He even spoke to a lawyer to understand his rights better. But the HOA board was different. They were close friends with Karen and her family. When Karen spoke, the other board members listened quietly. One afternoon, Ben went to the HOA office, hoping for answers. Instead, he was met with cold faces and polite refusals. Karen was there, sitting at the head of the table. She smiled in a way that made Ben's stomach twist. We have reviewed everything carefully, Karen said. And Mark's claim is valid. The papers are old, but they show a family connection to the property. Ben tried to explain again. I bought the cabin legally from the previous owner. I have proof of sale and registration. Karen shook her head slowly. The HOA must follow the rules. This is not personal. Ben left the office feeling a mix of anger and sadness. He thought about how he had trusted the HOA to protect the community and its members. But now, it seemed like the HOA was protecting only one family, the Karens. Things changed quickly after that day. Mark started using the cabin as if it belonged to him. One morning, Ben found the locks changed. He could not enter his own cabin. Mark had put up signs saying private property, no trespassing. Ben called the police, explaining the situation. The officers told him that this was a civil dispute and they could not get involved without a court order. Ben felt helpless. Neighbors watched quietly. Some felt sorry for Ben, but no one spoke openly against Karen. The HOA's power was strong, and people were afraid to cross them. Ben's heart broke. The place he had dreamed about for years was slipping away. One evening, Ben stood outside the locked cabin, looking at the faded wood and the small porch. The sun was setting, and the sky turned orange and pink. The lake was calm, but Ben's mind was restless. He thought about Karen and her son. How could they take something that was not theirs? How could the HOA, which was supposed to be fair, allow this to happen? Ben's phone buzzed. It was a message from one of the neighbors, a woman named Anna. She wrote, "I'm sorry, Ben. I wish I could help more." Ben replied, "Thank you, Anna. I'm trying to stay strong." That night, Ben sat by the window of his apartment far from the lake. He felt alone but also determined. He would not give up on the cabin or his dream. The next day, Ben returned to the lake community. He walked around quietly, watching Mark and Karen's friends enjoying the cabin. Mark was smiling, laughing with a group of people on the porch. It felt like a cruel joke. Ben decided to talk to Mark directly. He found him near the dock. "Mark," Ben said carefully. "This cabin belongs to me. I bought it fairly. Please, give me back my home." Mark looked at Ben with a cold smile. "It's not that simple, Ben. The HOA says this is my family's property. You need to deal with them." Ben's voice was soft but firm. "I don't want trouble. I just want what's right." Mark shrugged. "Then take it to court. But until then, this is my cabin." Ben walked away, his heart heavy but his spirit still fighting. Over the next few weeks, Ben tried everything. He went to the HOA meetings, spoke to the board, and wrote letters. But Karen and her friends blocked every attempt. The meetings were tense, with Karen speaking louder and more forcefully than before. Some neighbors started to whisper that Karen was using her power unfairly. But no one dared say it out loud. Ben realized that the fight was bigger than just his cabin. It was about honesty, fairness, and standing up to those who used power to hurt others. One evening, Ben met with a group of neighbors who were quietly unhappy with the HOA. They promised to support him. Together, they began to speak more openly, sharing their concerns about Karen's control. But Karen did not give up easily. She sent letters warning them about disrupting the peace and breaking community rules. Some neighbors grew afraid and stopped speaking. Ben felt the pressure, but he also felt a growing strength from those who stood by him. One night, as Ben sat by the lake, he thought about the long road ahead. The cabin was locked, the HOA was against him, and Karen's family held the power. But Ben remembered why he came here in the first place. The dream of peace, of a quiet place by the lake, was still alive. He made a silent promise to himself, no matter how hard the fight, he would never give up on his cabin. Days turned into weeks, and Ben's frustration grew. The lake cabin he had dreamed of for so long was now caught in a struggle he never expected. The HOA, led by Karen, seemed determined to push him out. Mark was living in the cabin as if it were his own, and the community was silent, scared to speak up. Ben knew he had to find a way to fight back, but he wanted to do it smartly. Anger would not help him now. He needed a plan that would make everyone see the truth without causing more trouble. One evening, after a long walk by the lake, Ben sat on a bench near the shore. The water was calm, and the sky was full of stars. He thought about everything that had happened, the unfairness, the broken trust, the quiet neighbors who felt trapped by Karen's power. Ben's eyes wandered around the community. He saw the neat fences, the clean yards, and the well-kept paths. The HOA was very strict about rules, especially about fences and property lines. That gave Ben an idea. If the HOA cared so much about boundaries and fences, maybe he could use that to send a message. Not to block people or cause trouble, but to show the community how unfair things had become. Ben stood up, feeling a spark of hope. What if he built a fence? Not just around his cabin, but a fence that reached all the way to the HOA's head office, the very place where Karen and her board sat, making decisions that hurt him. The fence would be a symbol. It would say, "This is my home. I belong here. And fairness matters." Ben knew it was a bold idea, but sometimes, boldness was what was needed to change things. The next day, Ben started planning. He measured his property and marked the lines carefully. Then, he drew a line from his cabin, across some of the common land, and straight to the HOA office. It would not block roads or paths, but it would be impossible to ignore. Ben went to a local store and bought wood, nails, and tools. He worked long hours, cutting and building. Every board he nailed was a small step in his fight for justice. Neighbors began to notice. Some came to watch quietly. A few asked questions, but Ben only smiled and said, "This fence is for the community, too." Karen heard about the fence quickly. One afternoon, she came to the cabin, her face tight with anger. "Ben, what do you think you are doing?" she demanded. Ben looked up from his work. "I'm building a fence. It's a way to show how important boundaries are and how unfair the situation has become." Karen frowned. "You can't build a fence on common land. That's against the rules." Ben shook his head. "I'm careful to stay within the paths that don't block anyone. This fence is not about causing trouble. It's about making people see the truth." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake, Ben. This will only make things worse." But Ben felt stronger than ever. He knew this fence was not just wood and nails, it was hope. Over the next few days, Ben worked harder. The fence grew longer, stretching through the trees and past the empty lots. The fence line became a path from the lake to the heart of the community. Some neighbors began to talk quietly among themselves. A few came by to thank Ben, telling him they were tired of feeling scared. They wanted fairness too. Karen tried to stop him. She sent letters and warnings, but Ben kept building. The fence was becoming a symbol of courage. One morning, the community woke up to see the fence reaching the HOA office. It stood tall and clear, a quiet reminder that every person mattered. Karen stood outside her office, staring at the fence. Her face was tight, but no one came to help her remove it. The neighbors were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Ben knew the fight was not over. But now, the whole community could see what was happening. The fence was more than wood, it was the voice of the quiet and the courage of the few. That night, Ben sat by the lake, tired but hopeful. The stars shone above, and the water reflected the light. He knew the road ahead would be long and hard, but he was ready. For the first time since he arrived, Ben felt that maybe, just maybe, he could win. The fence was complete, stretching from Ben's cabin all the way to the HOA office. It was a simple wooden fence, but to Ben and many in the community, it meant so much more. It was a clear message, one that said Ben was here to stay, and that fairness mattered. Word about the fence spread quickly. Some neighbors quietly admired Ben's courage, while others whispered their worries about Karen's reaction. No one wanted more trouble, but everyone secretly hoped this act would bring change. Karen, however, was furious. The very next morning, she arrived at the HOA office early, eyes fixed on the fence like it was a challenge she needed to conquer. She called an emergency meeting of the HOA board, insisting the fence must be removed immediately. Ben heard about the meeting through a few neighbors. This was his chance to speak, to finally make his voice heard in front of the people who had been ignoring him for so long. When the day of the meeting arrived, the room was crowded. Ben walked in quietly, carrying a folder with all his papers, the sale documents, photos of the cabin, and notes about the fence. Karen sat at the head of the table, her expression sharp. She looked ready to shut down anyone who disagreed with her. The meeting began with Karen speaking first, her voice strong. The fence is illegal. It crosses common land and violates community rules. We must remove it at once to protect the neighborhood. Ben waited patiently for his turn. When he stood up, the room fell silent. I built the fence because the rules have not been fair to me, Ben said clearly. My cabin was taken from me by a claim that is not right. I have proof that I bought this property legally. The fence is a symbol of my right to live here peacefully. Some neighbors nodded quietly, but others looked uncomfortable. Karen's friends on the board whispered among themselves, clearly unhappy with Ben's words. Ben opened his folder and began to explain. Here are the papers showing the sale of the cabin. The old documents Karen mentioned are confusing and not legally correct. I have asked for a fair investigation, but the HOA has delayed and ignored me. He paused, looking around the room. This fence is not just about property lines. It is about respect. Respect for the people who live here and the dreams they have. Karen stood up, her voice rising. You are causing division in the community. This fence is a provocation. It must be taken down. Ben shook his head. I am not trying to divide anyone. I want fairness for all. The room filled with tension. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, a voice came from the back. It was Mrs. Hayes, a kind woman who had lived in the neighborhood for many years. Karen, maybe it is time to listen, Mrs. Hayes said softly. We want peace too, but that can only happen if we treat everyone fairly. Other neighbors began to murmur in agreement. The power in the room started to shift. Karen's face turned red with anger, but she quickly regained her composure. This meeting is over, she said coldly. We will review everything again. Until then, the fence must stay. Ben nodded. This was not the end, but a small victory. People had heard him. The fence was not going anywhere. After the meeting, a few neighbors approached Ben quietly. They thanked him for standing up. One man, Mr. Lewis, spoke with a smile. Ben, you have started something important. The community is waking up. Ben felt a warmth inside. For the first time, he saw hope in the eyes of the people around him. But Karen was not done. That night, Ben found a letter slipped under his door. It was from the HOA, with a formal notice demanding that he stop building or repairing the fence any further. It warned of fines and legal action. Ben read the letter carefully. He knew this was a new challenge, but he was ready. The next day, Ben returned to the cabin and looked at the fence. The boards were strong and steady. The fence was more than wood, it was a symbol of his courage and determination. He decided to take a different approach. Instead of fighting alone, he reached out to a local newspaper. He shared his story, explaining the unfair treatment he had faced and the fight for his cabin. A reporter came to visit, spoke to Ben, and took photos of the fence. Soon, the story was published online and in the local paper. The article brought attention to the community. People from nearby towns read about Ben's struggle. Support messages started to come in from strangers who admired his courage. Back in the neighborhood, the news caused a stir. Some neighbors who had been silent before began to speak up. They shared their own stories of unfair treatment by the HOA. Karen was angry and worried. Her control was slipping. Ben knew the road ahead would still be hard. The HOA could use more rules and legal threats, but he had opened a door. The community was beginning to see the truth. That night, Ben sat by the lake, watching the stars. The water reflected the fence, strong and clear. He smiled quietly. The fight was not over, but he was no longer alone. He was ready to stand tall, just like the fence he had built. After the newspaper article, things began to change, but not as quickly as Ben hoped. The HOA, led by Karen, still resisted, but more neighbors started to show quiet support for Ben's cause. Some even came to visit his cabin, bringing small gifts or words of encouragement. One afternoon, Ben was working on the fence, fixing a loose board, when Anna, the neighbor who had messaged him before, walked over. She smiled warmly. "Ben, I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner," she said softly. "I was afraid of Karen and the HOA. But after reading the article, I realized we need to stand together." Ben nodded. "I understand. It's not easy. But we have to be strong." Anna looked around nervously. "There are others who feel the same way. Maybe we can gather them and talk." Ben's heart lifted. This was the first real sign of hope in a long time. They began to meet quietly in Anna's house. A small group of neighbors gathered to share their experiences with the HOA. Many spoke about unfair rules, hidden fees, and how Karen's family controlled everything. Ben listened carefully. It was clear that the problem was bigger than just his cabin. The HOA had been using its power unfairly for years. The group decided they needed to take action together. They wrote letters to the HOA board, asking for a fair meeting and a review of the rules. They also planned to speak at the next community meeting. When the day of the meeting arrived, the room was full. More neighbors than ever before had come. Ben felt nervous but ready. Karen stood at the front, looking as confident as ever. She began the meeting, but this time, the mood was different. The crowd was not quiet or scared. One by one, neighbors spoke up. They told stories of unfair fines, confusing rules, and how the HOA seemed to protect only Karen's family. Ben shared his story again, this time with the support of the community behind him. Karen's face grew red with anger, but the neighbors did not back down. The meeting lasted late into the evening. In the end, the HOA board agreed to form a special committee to review the ownership of Ben's cabin and to look at the HOA's rules more closely. This was a big step. For the first time, Karen's control was being questioned openly. After the meeting, Ben felt hopeful but knew the fight was not over. The special committee began their work. They reviewed old documents, listened to neighbors, and even talked to Ben's lawyer. Days later, Ben received a letter from the HOA. The committee had found that the claim by Karen's son was not strong enough to take his cabin away. They recommended that Ben's ownership be officially recognized. Ben felt a wave of relief. His cabin was finally safe. The news spread quickly. Neighbors congratulated Ben, and even some who had been quiet before came forward to support him. Karen was upset, but she could not ignore the decision. The HOA board had to accept it. The fence Ben built stood tall, now a symbol of victory and hope. Ben's dream of peaceful mornings by the lake was returning. He knew the fight had taught him much about courage, fairness, and the power of standing together. One evening, as the sun set over the lake, Ben stood by his cabin, looking at the fence and the water beyond. He smiled, feeling grateful for the neighbors who had stood with him and for the strength he had found inside himself. The cabin was more than just a building, it was a symbol of justice and hope. Ben was ready for whatever came next, knowing he was not alone. The days after the committee's decision felt like a fresh breeze to Ben. His cabin was finally recognized as his own, and the weight of worry lifted from his shoulders. But more than that, something had changed in the community. The neighbors who once stayed silent began to talk more openly. They shared stories, ideas, and hopes for the future of the lake neighborhood. Slowly, the fear that Karen and the HOA had used to keep people quiet started to disappear. Ben knew that healing would take time, but he was ready for the challenge. One morning, Ben received a call from Anna. "Ben, we have an idea. Since so many of us want to see the neighborhood become better, why don't we organize a community day? A chance to bring everyone together and start fresh." Ben liked the idea immediately. "That sounds perfect, Anna. We can invite everyone, even Karen." They worked together, sending out invitations to every house in the neighborhood. The idea was simple: a day of cleaning, planting flowers, and sharing food by the lake. A day to show that the community could be strong when everyone worked together. The day of the event arrived with clear blue skies and warm sunlight. Neighbors gathered by the lake, carrying tools, plants, and dishes of homemade food. Children ran around, laughing and playing. Ben stood by his cabin, looking at the faces around him, faces that had once seemed distant or fearful, now smiling and hopeful. Karen arrived too. She looked surprised to see so many people working together, but she did not say much. Ben hoped that maybe, just maybe, the day would help her see the importance of community. The work began. People cleaned the paths, painted fences, and planted colorful flowers along the lake's edge. The air was filled with chatter and laughter. As the afternoon came, everyone gathered for a picnic. Ben stood up to speak. "Thank you all for coming today," he said. "This place means a lot to me and to all of us. We have had hard times, but today is about new beginnings. About working together to make our community stronger and kinder." The crowd cheered softly. Anna smiled at Ben and whispered, "You did it?" Ben nodded, feeling a warm glow inside. Over the next weeks, the community continued to change. The HOA board had new members, neighbors who wanted fairness and kindness. Karen's influence became smaller as people took back their voice. Ben's cabin became a place of welcome. Neighbors stopped by for coffee or to share stories. The fence still stood strong, but now it was part of a beautiful garden, with flowers climbing along the wood. One quiet evening, Ben sat on his porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The lake was calm, reflecting the golden light. He thought about the long journey, the fight, the fear, the hope. It had been hard, but he had never given up. A soft knock came at the door. It was Mark, Karen's son. Ben was surprised but invited him in. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," Mark said quietly. "I didn't understand before, but I see now how hard you fought and how much this place means to you." Ben smiled. "Thank you, Mark. It means a lot to hear that." They talked for a while, finding common ground. It was not a perfect friendship, but it was a start. Ben looked around his cabin, the place that had been his dream and his battle. Now it was his home. The sun disappeared behind the lake, and stars began to shine. Ben felt peace. He knew that the fight for fairness was never easy, but with hope, courage, and community, new beginnings were possible. And this was just the beginning of a brighter future by the lake.